My name is Marissa Alexander, and I was prosecuted for aggravated assault for defending myself against my abuser in 2010. I fired what essentially would be called a warning shot and was arrested and prosecuted, and I actually did the stand your ground hearing. That was one of the things my attorneys brought up, so I did the stand your ground hearing. This is back when it was pretty, I guess big, like 2011, 12, I suppose. And as a result, I did not get my stand your ground granted. I went to trial and I lost. I think a lot of the things that were missing from my case was the fact that my abuser had prior acts of violence that was not allowed in the courtroom. I had just had a baby. She was 8 days old prior to him attacking me. I was in my career. I have an undergrad in information technology. My master's is in business. I had been in this company for 10 years and I was in management. I had a concealed permit. I had a restraining order at the time for no violent contact. And these are just some of the things that were minimized, if not brought up at all, as I went through my situation and survived and ultimately was punished. So there had been a history of abuse between myself and my then husband, and I was actually on my way out of that relationship. He didn't know it though. So obviously during the time when you're trying to leave, it's a very crucial time for you. One of the things that people don't know is that I was pregnant and I was already on bed rest. So I had dilated like 3 centimeters at 5 months. So I was staying with my mom and I would go back and forth to the house. And the only reason why I did that was to kind of appease him, to keep him from, being so controlling and invasive in my life. But at the same time, trying to smuggle clothes out when he was out traveling. And that particular day, I had let my sister know to come over so she could help me get the rest of my stuff. And I didn't anticipate that he was going to come back to that house. And so when he did, it was a little bit of a shocker, as well as the fact that he had brought his 2 sons, which were my 2 stepsons. Essentially, I had took pictures of my baby. I had given her first bath because she was in the NICU. She was born a month and a half early. And because he decided to look at messages in my phone as opposed to those pictures, misinterpreted something while I went to use the restroom. He attacked me in the restroom. I shut the door to try to lock it. Well, I did lock it. It was locked. And I figured because he was on 10 and what I had never seen before, if I could just create a barrier between me and him, maybe he would leave because he was saying he was going to leave. When you're on a state of blackout, he didn't want to leave. So he broke the door open. He attacked me in the bathroom. And at that point, I'm trying to fight my way out. I was not able to leave that day. My SUV was in the garage, and so I made a decision because I always kept my firearm in my truck because I didn't have a gun safe. I was raised by military. My dad was retired military. He taught us all how to shoot. He took us to the range, told us how to, carry responsibly, and one of the things he had was a gun safe. I did not have one. So I kept mine in the truck. When I could not leave the garage, the last thing I was going to do was confront him, just given 8 days of birth and 100 pounds more than me. And he threatened to kill me, so I fired my morning shot. So I didn't think I did anything wrong. That's number one. Number two, I was under the impression of castle doctrine, never heard of stand your ground. So even when Stand Your Ground had came out, I think in like 2005, here it is, my case 5 years later. And when I went to get my permit, it was under castle doctrine, which means that stand your ground is an expansion on the self-defense castle doctrine, which allows you to use that self-defense outside of your home. With castle doctrine, you have to do everything in your power to retreat before using lethal force. And I believe that I had done that, and I also believe that I didn't do anything wrong. Not until I was arrested and was awaiting trial and pre-trial did my then attorneys bring Stand Your Ground to me, and that was the first time I had ever heard it. So thought sure I was going to get it because I was like, well, if you look at it, it sounds about like what I did. But essentially, in the argument, in the briefs that were written, the state said I should have went out the back door, or I should have went through the window, I guess, as if I was an, what do you call those things? an agent of some sort. Like, I had some tactical training. So I didn't. And I think that I did the very best I could that day. And if I had to do it again, I would. Stand your ground is a pretty touchy topic for people. I think from an African American standpoint, as we first came to really know it, was the Trayvon Martin case, and so as we saw a child be murdered, because that's what it was not self-defense, and that law being used essentially when he went to trial, he did not have a hearing per se like I did, because it was ruled at the scene of the crime. Once he went to trial, it's in the jury instructions. I know that because I had pretty much the same jury instructions. So for me, I believe that once you take it outside and you put it to where you have to have a hearing, and then as a defendant, where my victim per se had the opportunity to speak. So now we're talking about, I think they call it prima facie. I'm now having to assert affirmative defense. I now have to speak against my case. That puts me to give up the most crucial aspect of what a defense attorney means, which is that the ability to not testify in your own defense, that Fifth Amendment. And so as a result, there's things that I had to disclose, which also gives the state your defense ahead of time. That's even pre-trial. I think it was controversial at the time. I think that people still are really vague upon how to use it. I think the people in the system are very unclear about what it is, and can be very subjective in the way they interpret it. And so because of that, people are just scared to say, you know what, in a sense, this makes more sense. And I think that this would have been a case because he was not killed. And self-defense doesn't have to be lethal. It doesn't have to be fatal. I was able to defend myself and nobody was harmed. It worked. So if anything, it should have been. And I think it didn't work. Higher powers thought it would be the case to be. However, it raised the conversation more about stand your ground. So for me, honestly, I think race had a lot to do with it. I also think this, people being uneducated about it. I think politics had a lot to do with it. And all those things were kind of a perfect storm for it to be a standing conversation. And for some reason now I'm like the expert on stand your ground. The only thing that I really could do was give back. I had so much support in one of those organizations where people from Survived and Punished, like Elisa Area and Free Marissa Now campaign, Samaya Coleman. These are people that were not even from Jacksonville, Florida, that came in and just cared about my situation and said it's important that Marissa, as a woman of color, stays relevant, because if not, then I would just be another person in prison serving out a 20-year sentence, which is a 20-year day-for-day minimum mandatory sentence. So these things happen. The best thing that I could do was to give back. I couldn't pay for the time and the effort that so many advocates and supporters, the people that wrote, the people that donated, the people that signed a petition. This is my way of giving back. So whenever this type of activity is going on, I'm going to try my very best to be a part of it. I say all the time, I'm not the only Marissa Alexander. There are many Marissa Alexanders out there. And when I went to prison to see, other women who had already done 20 years, survived and had instances where they stood their ground, and now they've done 20 years and they have life sentences. And then to hear about it once I came out, to get mail from women who are inside, who are experiencing it, to get mail from men who also have been in situations where they've had to defend themselves. Some of them have been able to use my case to get off. So just being able to see that aspect of it, to realize that the direction that I'm going in by using, I guess, my name per se, to speak out on it has been, it's taxing sometimes, but it's so necessary, because you give a voice to people who wouldn't normally have a voice. So at one point when I was incarcerated, somebody was my voice. I only feel like it's my duty, just as, in human, my human accountability, my moral accountability, to be the voice for somebody else. once I was released on bond and my case was overturned, my attorneys was like, no interviews, no nothing. And that's exactly what I did. I just didn't do anything for the full year. I pretty much worked on my case with my attorneys. The best thing to do was not to give the state any more ammunition to use in court, had I gone to trial. When I was on pretrial, once my case was resolved in terms of me taking the plea, I still had 2 years of house arrest. And at that point, the state attorney that prosecuted me was still in the office. Now, what most people don't know is that my then now ex-husband had tried like at least once or twice to get me violated while I was on probation. Had nothing to do with anything I said. I mean, you understand I'm on an electronic monitor. I'm having to adhere to a schedule. I have to go and pay fees. I think by the time the fees were done, everything was close to about 10 grand for 2 years of ankle monitors. So imagine the people who can't afford it, that they put them on it and end up violating. And so I didn't want to be in a position where anything that I did would violate me, and I essentially let myself down. And I honestly wasn't really worried about myself as much. I was worried about everybody else that fought for me and my children. So I walked a really fine line, but I used that time to come back and I just used that time to be strategic in terms of writing my book, starting my nonprofit, doing a whole lot of research. I used that time so that they would wish that it's the last thing you should have did is put me on house arrest for 2 years, because I wanted to make sure that I could come out and hit the ground running. So, the nonprofit is another way of me being able to just give back. Mine is also domestic violence, but it's also more social. So being from the perspective of being incarcerated for that amount of time, and having the opportunity to get out, understanding my background and understanding my place and the support that I had in my family, and then being incarcerated with women and people who did not have the opportunities that I did, and realizing at the root of a lot of these issues that spring up in the community is some type of trauma from some type of violence, whether it was something that was inflicted on them or something that they had solved themselves. So once I realized that being the root and the things that came out of those things, and then the systems that were put in place to actually punish, mental healthness and oppression is punishing it, and actually just the trauma that's also being punished, I realized that, I wanted to kind of take a holistic approach to my nonprofit. So it's not just domestic violence, it's criminal reform, restoration and parole, school to prison pipeline, because we were talking about our generation of children, of young people who are not well. And as they are not well, they're going along, and this is kind of the byproduct of what we're seeing. You're dealing with things like the crack epidemic and the kids that had those chemical imbalances that were born from them, and the things that they're now seeing I lived amongst it. So once all of that came together as a puzzle, I figured the best way for me to be able to lend my support and help was to be a part of, different ones. I don't want to zero in on one thing per se. I feel like they all are collective, but are, systemic of some bigger trauma that we need to kind of work through. So that's when my nonprofit comes in. As people get to know me, that I can build the credibility so that they can see that they're investing in my project as opposed to donating to it. I don't just want your donation, that would be nice, but I want your investment in the understanding how we all are impacted. If you're not impacted in the community yourself on the front end, you will be on the back end as a taxpayer, as somebody who at some point be a victim, somebody who could be, the person that your family this happens to your family. Ultimately, your children, if you have them, will be raised in the community of this type of, you can't keep yourself away from it and shelter forever. Play your part in it, how small or big you choose to do so, be able to do that. And with my nonprofit, I'm asking for people to invest in, me willing to be able to go to, like with in Jacksonville, we have a Jacksonville Children's Commission and Jacksonville City Council, where there's funding and programs, but guess what? They don't necessarily want to go into the communities to do it. And I think that has a lot to do with I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a gap in age and a generation, and they really don't know how to relate. And guess what? Nobody's saying that that's a problem. What I am saying is, gives me the resources and tools to be able to go to those communities and do what you wouldn't necessarily be willing to do, or you're uncomfortable with doing. And nobody's going to paint you as a racist or anything for not doing it. Just understanding that there's a barrier there that you may not be able to cross because you don't understand it. You may want to. You may even you have the funding, but you don't know how to build it. Well, there's groups out there like myself, my nonprofit, that who are willing to do that. And if you take the handcuffs off and give me the ability to do it, with of course some accountability to the powers that be, that are helping allow me to do it, because otherwise it's not going to get done. You're going to have funding and programs and no participants. So I'm saying invest in my nonprofit to be able to do the work that you may not be willing to do or don't understand or uncomfortable with doing. Not everybody is comfortable with being in the forefront, right? And I can say as a personality, I'm really not. It takes effort and work. So when the people who have been in it, survivors, are not as comfortable with doing that, I understand that. But there's also some way or some capacity for them to join in that effort. And I tell people all the time, you don't have to do what somebody else is doing or look like that person is doing it, but you can be in the movement but not be in the front. You don't have to be. You play whatever role you play. If you're like the best stamper and get the mail out person ever, then do that, because you are contributing. Seriously. I think people feel like you have to be massive in this movement, and you don't have to be. You just have to be a part and willing and committed, right? So as a survivor, I go into the state capitol like I'm supposed to be there. Any room I walk in, I'm supposed to be there. And so I've gone to the state capitol, and I walk in and I spoke with representatives, and I looked them in the eye, because guess what? We put our pants on one leg at a time, just like you do. I just happen to have a story, and I'm sure you do too. I just don't know your story. You happen to know mine. So I try to make them, not make them, but I try to win them over by just having a conversation. There's no pressure. I'm not guilted into anything. I'm not ashamed about what I went through. As you can see, I'm nice and tatted up, but I can sit down with the best of them and just have a conversation, because at the end of the day, we're just kind of all related and connected, whether we want to be or not, we really are. So that's the kind of thing that as a survivor, you have to I try to put myself in a position where I understand where the other person is coming from. So I seek to understand before I'm understood. In the communities, I think we're so stuck. I think we're stuck because we see such this adversarial, against the systems per se in us. And I'm saying, okay, we get the establishments in the systems, but I'm talking about, it's us. I think T.I. says it's us or else. Like, we have the ability and the power. We have so much more power than we know. And so, I challenge us that are not in some capacity doing something, to do that, whatever it looks like. Invest in your own community in a way that you are being a part of, helping, even if it's if it's mentorship. Going to those meetings and making your voice heard. If you're sitting at home all day, call the state, call and represent. Let you be the person that calls and writes. There's something that everybody can do. It doesn't have to look like what people think it looks like. You don't have to be out there with a microphone in the front of everybody. That may not be you, but you can. You can get on social media and talk about it. You can spread the articles, the blogs. Honestly, I go out there and read the different blogs, and then I just share it on my news outlet, because they may not know about it. It's so many little things that can be done, and I think some people are doing that, but we can create, more so of that. So I say get involved in little aspects, or as bigger aspects if you want to, but just get involved.